On a stretch of Italian highway between Milan and Bologna, a test rider named Giancarlo Fuzzi Librenti leaned forward, tucked in behind the tiny headlamp fairing, and rolled the throttle all the way open. The speedometer needle swept past 60, then 80, then touched the far side of 100 miles an hour. And then, with no warning at all, the rear tire came apart underneath him. Not a slow leak, not a wobble that built up over a few seconds. The tread itself peeled off the rim at full speed and went cartwheeling down the autostrada behind him while he fought a bike that suddenly had almost nothing connecting it to the road. He kept it upright, he survived. And what he had just proven, in the most violent way imaginable, was that Ducati's engineers had built something that no tire on the planet in 1964 was rated to handle. The machine underneath him was called the Apollo. It was the biggest, heaviest, most powerful motorcycle Ducati had ever attempted. It was never sold to a single customer. Only 2 complete examples were ever built. Most riders who love Ducati today have never even heard its name, because the company buried it so completely that it sat forgotten in a New Jersey warehouse for almost 20 years. But if you have ever watched a Ducati Panigale scream down a straightaway, or watched Casey Stoner win a MotoGP title on a Desmo Z, you are looking at the great-grandchild of a bike that got strangled before it ever had the chance to prove what it could do. This is the story of how Ducati built a motorcycle more than a decade ahead of its time, and how the one thing that made it special was also the exact thing that got it killed. To understand why the Apollo exists at all, you have to rewind to a company that, by the start of the 1960s, was in real trouble. Ducati in 1960 was not the racing icon it is today. It was one of dozens of small Italian manufacturers getting crushed by a single car. The Fiat 500 had gone on sale a few years earlier, and for the first time, ordinary Italian families could afford 4 wheels instead of 2. Motorcycle sales across the entire country collapsed. Gilera pulled out of Grand Prix racing. Moto Guzzi pulled out a year after that. Ducati followed in 1958, walking away from the World Championship paddock because it simply could not justify the cost anymore. By 1960, the factory in Bologna was producing around 6,000 motorcycles a year, and it was only staying afloat because the Italian government was propping it up with subsidies. Largely because Bologna was a stronghold of Italy's Communist Party, and Rome didn't want a politically sensitive factory collapsing on its watch. With the home market gutted, Ducati leaned harder and harder on one single relationship: its American importer, Berliner Motor Corporation, run by 2 brothers, Joe and Mike Berliner, out of New Jersey. By the early 60s, the Berliners were moving something like 85% of everything Ducati built. When a distributor controls that much of your output, they don't just sell your product anymore. They start deciding what you build next. And Joe Berliner had an idea, a big one. He had noticed something about the American police motorcycle market that most people never thought twice about. Because of antitrust rules, police departments across the United States were technically required to at least consider more than one manufacturer before signing a contract. In practice, that almost never mattered, because Harley-Davidson had 0 real competition. But on paper, the door was open. If a foreign manufacturer could build a bike that actually met police specifications, there was a path onto the streets of American cities that had never existed before. The specifications themselves were brutally specific and almost designed to lock everyone else out. A minimum engine size of 1,200 cubic centimeters. A minimum wheelbase of 60 inches. And tires, this detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. So hold on to it, 5 inches wide, mounted on 16-inch rims. Car-style tires. Not motorcycle tires. Nobody in the industry thought twice about that requirement in 1961, because nobody involved could have imagined an engine that would ever ask more of those tires than a lumbering, low-revving Harley V-twin ever had. That single number 16 inches was about to become the most important detail in the entire story, and almost nobody who signed off on it saw it coming. Berliner approached Ducati's chief, Dr. Giuseppe Montano, and asked a simple question. Could Ducati build something that could beat a Harley-Davidson on its own turf, at a price American police departments could actually justify paying? Montano took the idea to his chief engineer, a man named Fabio Taglioni. And Taglioni is where this story really gets interesting. This wasn't some administrator throwing dice on a whim. Taglioni was, by any honest measure, one of the great motorcycle engineers of the 20th century. He would go on to design close to 1,000 different engine configurations across a 30-year career running Ducati's engineering department, from desmodromic valve singles that dominated Grand Prix racing in the 50s, all the way through to the V-twins that would define the brand for decades. And here's the detail that makes this project feel almost predestined. Back when Taglioni was a university student in Bologna in 1948, working on his mechanical engineering degree, he had already sketched out a design for a small-capacity V4 engine as a class project. The idea had been sitting in the back of his head for over a decade before anyone gave him the budget and the excuse to actually build one. Rome, predictably, dragged its feet. Government bureaucrats controlling Ducati's finances were skeptical of funding a bike this ambitious, and the negotiations between Ducati and Berliner stretched on for close to 2 years before a deal was finally struck in 1961. Berliner agreed to underwrite the development costs. In exchange, Berliner got to dictate the core specifications the bike had to meet. The name they picked for the project was Apollo, in honor of the American manned space program that had just begun capturing the country's imagination. The brothers wanted something that sounded like the future. Taglioni was told, essentially, to make it bigger and faster than anything Harley had. Beyond that one instruction, the actual engineering was entirely his call, and what he came back with was audacious. A 90-degree V4 engine, air-cooled, with a 180-degree crankshaft that gave it near-perfect primary balance without needing a counterweight to cancel out vibration. 1,257 cubic centimeters, a bore and stroke of 84.5 by 56 millimeters, which made it, at the time, the most over-square engine Ducati had ever built. Short stroke, high revving, built to make power at engine speeds that a lazy American V-twin would never see. 2 valves per cylinder, worked by push rods and rocker arms rather than the exotic bevel gear-driven camshafts Ducati was famous for. Because this engine needed to be simple and rugged enough for police mechanics to actually service in the field. A single gear-driven camshaft sat between the cylinder banks, laid out almost exactly like a Vate car engine of the era. Taglioni looked at water cooling and rejected it as unnecessary complication. Joe Berliner personally pushed for shaft drive, the way BMWs did it. And Taglioni turned that down too, because he didn't trust it for this application, going instead with a duplex chain final drive. But he wasn't closed-minded about everything. He actually left space inside the gearbox housing to accept a Sachs automatic transmission down the line, in case Ducati ever wanted to build a fully automatic version for the American market. Think about how forward-thinking that is. In 1962, an Italian engineer was already designing a motorcycle with a modular option for an automatic gearbox. The finished engine made a claimed 100 horsepower at 7,000 RPM in its full power sport tune, running 4 separate 32mm carburetors and a 10-to-1 compression ratio. For comparison, the top Harley of that era, the Duo Glide with its 74 cubic inch V-twin, made 55 horsepower. The Apollo wasn't just competitive. It nearly doubled the output of the bike it was designed to replace in a package that, remarkably, weighed less than the Harley it was aimed at, 270 kilograms dry, against roughly 291 for the American machine. And the whole engine, despite housing 4 cylinders instead of 2, measured only about 18 inches wide, tucked in tight enough that the bike didn't feel absurdly bulky sitting next to a Harley. Every detail was built around the police brief. A 200-watt generator sat opposite the clutch, sized specifically to run sirens, radios, and emergency lighting without draining the battery. There was a proper electric starter, borrowed conceptually from a contemporary Fiat car, for officers who didn't want to kickstart a V4 on a cold morning, alongside a traditional kickstart for anyone brave enough to use it. Seriani, one of the best suspension houses in Italy, built custom forks and shocks, and to meet the police wheelbase and tire requirements, the whole thing rode on that mandated 16-inch wheel and tire combination, the same detail that was quietly waiting to become the story's villain. The first complete prototype was finished and handed over to the Berliners in a formal ceremony in March of 1964. It was painted a loud, ceremonial gold, wearing a wide cowboy-style saddle, with a chrome grab rail, high pulled-back handlebars, and fat white wall tires specially built by Pirelli to fit those car-style 16-inch rims. Ducati's own test rider, a former Grand Prix mechanic named Franco Farn, took it out for its first real shakedown run and came back with a verdict that has followed this bike through every article written about it since. It handles, he said, like a truck. Heavy steering, a long wheelbase. Cumbersome at low speed, exactly what you'd expect from a machine built to satisfy a police spec sheet rather than a racetrack. But in a straight line, the Apollo was a monster. It would pull past 200 kilometers an hour, making it, in prototype form, the single most powerful production intent motorcycle built anywhere in post-war Europe. And this is exactly where things started to go wrong. Because a truck-like chassis wearing car tires had just been handed an engine that could push it to speeds nobody had designed those components to survive. Early testing revealed the abundance of power almost immediately, and it didn't take long for that power to reveal a fatal flaw. During sustained high-speed running, the kind of running an American police motorcycle would genuinely be expected to do on a freeway pursuit, the specially built 16-inch Pirelli tires would start to balloon under load. At sustained speeds near 100 miles an hour, the tread would begin to separate from the casing. And that is precisely what happened to Giancarlo Fuzzi-Librenti on the Milan-Bologna autostrada, in the moment this story opened with. He described his survival afterward, quite simply, as a miracle. Word of similar near misses started filtering back from testing happening in America too. Stories of test riders nearly losing control on banked ovals and long freeway straights, the same tire failure repeating itself again and again. So Ducati did what any engineering team would do. They pulled the power back. The full 100-horsepower sport tune was replaced with a softer camshaft, lower 8-to-1 compression, and a single 24mm carburetor feeding each pair of cylinders instead of 4 individual carbs. That dropped output to 80 horsepower at 6,000 RPM. And the tire problem persisted anyway. So they detuned it again, compression down further to 7-to-1, even softer camshaft timing, bringing power all the way down to 65 horsepower. Only at that point, castrated to roughly 2/3 of its original output, did the tire failures finally become what engineers of the era were willing to call acceptable. Sit with that for a second, because it's the emotional core of this entire story. The bike had been built to beat Harley-Davidson on raw performance, and the only way to make it survive contact with the road was to strip away over 1/3 of the very performance that made it worth building in the first place. Even neutered down to 65 horsepower, it was still stronger than Harley's 55. But the margin that had once been overwhelming was now just modest. The knockout punch had been sanded down into a jab. And here's where the business side of the story turns just as ugly as the engineering side. Berliner had been so confident in the Apollo's potential that he'd already started marketing it before the tire problems fully surfaced. He'd printed brochures. He'd quoted prices $1,500 for the detuned touring version, $1,800 for the higher state sport model reserved for police contracts. Those numbers sound modest today, but at the time they were more than double what a comparable Harley cost, and substantially above the price of European twins from BMW and Britain that would have been the Apollo's real competition in the civilian market. The pitch had always been simple. Yes, we cost more, but we outperform everything else in this price range. Once the engine had to be detuned to survive its own tires, that pitch collapsed. A 65 horsepower Ducati at nearly double the price of a 55 horsepower Harley was a much harder sell, and against BMW and British twins that were lighter and cheaper. The Apollo's power-to-weight advantage had basically evaporated too. That gave Rome exactly the excuse it needed. The bureaucrats controlling Ducati's funding had never been fully behind this project to begin with. It was, after all, a large financial commitment flowing out of a factory run out of a Communist Party stronghold, funded by a government controlled by the opposing Christian Democrats. With the detuned Apollo now suitable, realistically, only for the narrower police contract market rather than the wider touring market Berliner had dreamed about, the projected sales numbers no longer justified the enormous tooling costs Ducati would need to actually put the bike into mass production. Early in 1965, funding was pulled. Montano had no choice but to cancel the project. Berliner was, by every account, appalled. He had already shown the Apollo to police chiefs. He had promised production would start that same year. And now the whole thing was simply over. The second prototype, the more refined black and silver version, cleaner styling, 4 racing Dell'Orto carburetors, shown publicly once at the Daytona Motorcycle Show during Cycle Week in early 1965, went straight from that show floor back into a storage corner of the Berliner warehouse in Hasbrouck Heights, New Jersey. And there it sat. Not for a year, not for 5 years. For roughly 2 decades, gathering dust in a warehouse, while the rest of the motorcycle world moved on without ever knowing it existed. Here's a detail that says everything about how Taglioni himself felt about what had been taken away from him. One of the 2 spare Apollo engines that Ducati had built stayed on display in his personal office. Not in a museum, not in a storeroom. On display where he could see it every single day for 20 years, until his retirement in 1984. A brilliant engineer, quietly keeping the physical evidence of his most ambitious idea sitting on a shelf a few feet from his desk for 2 full decades, as if he never fully accepted that it was dead. But the Apollo story doesn't actually end with cancellation. And this is where things get interesting again, because ideas this good rarely disappear completely. They just go underground and resurface somewhere else. 5 years after the project was killed, Taglioni designed Ducati's first overhead cam 90-degree V-twin, the engine architecture that would go on to define the entire Ducati brand for the next half-century. And that V-twin wasn't invented from nothing. It was, quite literally, half of the Apollo's V4. Take the 4-cylinder engine, cut it down the middle, and you get almost exactly the layout of the V-twin that powered every classic Ducati bevel drive motorcycle that followed, and every Desmo V-twin after that. The bike that never sold a single unit ended up being the technical ancestor of the machines that actually saved the company. And it doesn't stop there. 30 years after the Apollo was buried, Honda and then Suzuki built their own championship-winning V-twin racing engines using layouts that traced directly back to the format Ducati had pioneered. And decades after that, when Ducati finally returned to a V4 configuration for real, it wasn't for a police cruiser. It was for the Desmo's Ditty. The bike Casey Stoner rode to a MotoGP World Championship in 2007. And the direct ancestor of the Panigale V4 street bikes Ducati sells today. Every modern Ducati V4 owes something to a canceled police motorcycle from 1965 that almost nobody ever got to ride. Consider the timeline here for a second, because it puts just how far ahead the Apollo actually was into real perspective. Honda's CB750, the bike most people credit as the machine that invented the modern 4-cylinder Superbike, didn't arrive until 1969, 5 full years after the Apollo prototype was handed over in that ceremony. And even then, the CB750 only made 68 horsepower. Kawasaki's legendary Zone, celebrated as a genuine leap forward when it launched in 1972, made 81 horsepower. The detuned, castrated, tire-safe version of the Apollo was already making 65 horsepower back in 1964. In its full sport tune, it had made 100. There was no other 4-cylinder motorcycle on the market anywhere in the world at the time the Apollo was built. Ducati had accidentally built the first real superbike nearly a decade before the category even had a name, and then buried it in a warehouse because the tire industry hadn't caught up yet. So what happened to the actual bikes? The fate of the original gold prototype is genuinely unknown. It may still exist somewhere, forgotten in a private collection, or it may have been scrapped decades ago. Nobody has been able to trace it. The surviving black and silver prototype had a stranger journey. When the Berliner Motor Corporation finally closed its doors in the early 1980s, a vintage parts specialist in Cincinnati named Bob Shantz, running a company called Domi Racer, bought the contents of that old New Jersey warehouse, including the forgotten Apollo, described at the time as shop-worn and neglected, missing only its original fuel tank. In 1986, a Japanese collector named Hiroaki Iwashita bought the bike from Domi Racer for $17,000, serious money at the time, and quietly added it to his private collection back in Japan. For close to a decade, essentially nobody outside that collection knew the bike still existed. It resurfaced publicly in 1995 at a vintage motorcycle show in Tokyo, which is what finally alerted Ducati itself to the fact that one of its own lost prototypes was still alive. After Ducati's factory museum was established in Bologna in the mid-1990s, Iwashita loaned the bike back to the company that built it, and for a time it sat on display in the very city it had been designed and built in 30 years after it left. Decades later, a journalist named Alan Cathcart finally got to actually ride the surviving Apollo, the first time anyone from outside Ducati had ever been allowed to test it, because the tire fears from 1964 had never fully gone away, even on museum-fitted, brand-new old stock rubber. His verdict, after finally getting to experience what Franco Farn and Giancarlo Fuzzi Librenti had felt more than 40 years earlier, was that the engine felt shockingly smooth for its era, closer in character to a BMW Boxer twin than to anything else from the 1960s, and that riding it felt less like riding a machine from 1964 and more like riding something built 15 years later. The chassis was still exactly as heavy and truck-like as Farn had described all those decades before, and the 16-inch car-style tires still felt just as unsuited to real cornering as they always had. But the engine itself, Cathcart said, was the real story. A genuinely modern, genuinely advanced piece of engineering trapped inside a chassis and a tire package that the era simply wasn't ready to support. Here's the question worth sitting with as this story closes. If tire technology in 1964 had been capable of handling 100 horsepower on a 16-inch rim, the entire timeline of the modern Superbike might look completely different. Ducati might have owned the 4-cylinder performance category 5 years before Honda ever built the CB750. Instead, one detail, a single tire specification, written into a police procurement document by bureaucrats who never imagined an engine this powerful showing up to meet it, quietly determined the fate of one of the most advanced motorcycles of the entire decade. Not a design flaw, not a lack of engineering talent, just a machine that arrived at the wrong moment in the history of rubber. 2 bikes were built. One is lost, the other sits today as a reminder that sometimes the thing that kills a great idea isn't a bad idea at all, it's simply being right before the rest of the world is ready to catch up.